Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. Now a couple of years ago I made this black 1940s style dress over on Patreon with its long dolman sleeves, and it's actually just so comfy and so versatile and useful. I can dress this up or down, dress it for daytime, dress it for evening, just changing my accessories up, that I've worn this dress quite a lot over the last few years. So I decided it would be a good idea to go ahead and make another very similar dress to this one, only in navy blue. I will be changing up a couple of the details, but the general silhouette will remain the same. Let's jump on over to the blue patterning table of doom and get started. And I begin with my all-in-one bodice block front and back. If you want to see how I make these from the standard bodice block, I do have a video on that here, and I can link that in a card as well. But I will begin by tracing the front here, including all relevant extra details like where the shoulder point originally was, and also tracing in the remaining waist dart. And this will be my center front, which I will cut out in the fold, and I'll begin by raising that shoulder point 3/8 of an inch right at the shoulder area here, and just grading that from the neckline outwards. Of course, I'll be drawing a long sleeve onto here shortly. I'm going to come out a 1/2 inch from that shoulder point and connect that down into the apex, and then I will come another 1.5 inches away from that so I can move my dart fullness up into 2 tucks along the shoulder line. Now from my shoulder point, I want to extend this line another 22.5 inches, which is the length of my arm from my shoulder point. I just know this measurement from drafting sleeves, but of course you can just hold a measuring tape up to your shoulder point and measure down to your wrist as well to find out how long you want your sleeves to be. I'm going to grab my measuring tape here just to get a couple of indications for how wide I need the sleeve to be. Honestly, I could have made this a bit wider for more of a bat winged effect. I was kind of going with the bare minimum that I needed to fit on my lower arm, so the lower part of my sleeve here is actually quite fitted today, which works well because I'll be working with actually a 4-way stretch fabric. I thought it was a 2-way stretch. When I pulled the fabric back out, I realized it was 4-way, so I'll have to deal with that during the sewing process. But I want to make sure my hand will fit through the end of this, but other than that, I just need to curve this off in this huge shape, connecting the curve down into the side seam, really just exaggerating everything I had done for the regular all-in-one sleeve for this long sleeve version. Alright, so I just have to make sure this is wide enough that my arm will still fit in here. Again, if you're not sure and you don't have any stretch in the fabric you'll be using, you do want to perhaps make a mock-up for this kind of thing if you've never made a sleeve like this before. I will make this a short, close V-neck up here, just for a tiny bit of interest, but I do want to keep the neckline pretty high here, just for a lot of brooch real estate. As we all know, I love a brooch, and I like having a lot of space to position one or two, depending on how I'm feeling on the day. I will lay a piece of paper over this neckline and go ahead and trace a 2.5 inch wide facing for finishing this neckline later. Of course, with something like this, you could do a full lining as well, but I'm just going to be finishing the neckline with facing and then hemming all the other raw edges that I encounter. And this facing too will be cut along the fold, just like the center front of the bodice. And now that everything is cut out and my sleeve and my neckline are arranged, I can go ahead and move this dart fullness around. So I'm going to cut down from these potential new shoulder tucks down to the apex, then I'll cut up along a dart leg and close that dart, moving that fullness up into the new shoulder tucks. I could use these as darts, as gathering. Different options up here, but I am just going to use these as 4-inch long tucks today. So I will go ahead and kind of split this extra fullness into 2 tucks up here, and I'll fill that in with some spare paper. Again, you could sew these as darts or even as external darts or external tucks, which would be quite fun as well. Tape all this down, and I will fold this how I plan to sew it, and then I will cut off the excess so I have the correct shape at the edge. Like so, I will go ahead and tape down my floops on the other side so nothing gets torn apart on accident, and then I'll flip this back over and just mark down 4 inches along these dart legs so I know where to end my tucks when I sew these later. You can make them as long or as short as you want, honestly. You can just do them as pleats along the seam line if you want to do. Or again, use this as gathering. Many different ways to control the dart fullness. 40's Dolman Dress 2024 front. Let's go ahead and start working on the back now. I begin with 1 inch of seam allowance back here for my center back where my zipper will go eventually, and then I will trace the all-in-one bodice block back along that, again marking the shoulder indication and the dart, especially because I'll be keeping the back dart exactly where it is today. I'm not going to move this around or do anything fancy with it. It's just going to stay right where it belongs. I just need to extend the length of this sleeve to match the front. I'll start by lining up the shoulder point, and forgetting that I need to tip this shoulder up first. Oh yeah, that's right. So let me tip this up, that 3/8 of an inch at the shoulder point. There we go. And then line this up and trace the top shoulder seam, as it were. Shoulder seam that turns into an arm sleeve seam, like so. Now because of the way that the all-in-one sleeve itself is drafted, the basic block that I'm using here is drafted Some of the dart fullness is used to create the shape on the front, and of course we're dealing with less dart fullness on the back where there is no bust. So once I lengthen this, there will be a tiny bit of an issue with the length of the underarm seam on the back versus the front, because the front will be a little bit shorter. And all I'm going to do is just use a little bit of a wedge of fullness. I'm going to draw a line from about 1 inch in from the shoulder point down through the underarm curve. So I have this hinge point here, and I can kind of hinge the underarm seam of the back closed. This again is just to make sure that the front and the back line up along this underarm / side seam. And you'll see exactly how much I need to take out in just a second. I figured actually let's just go ahead and measure the front and measure the back. Go ahead and line those up. I'll trace in the same curve at least from the front, using the front as a guide. And then I'll go ahead and measure my underarm / side seam, because it is all in one today. There is no underarm seam, there is no side seam, it's all one thing. Measure how long the back is. Looks like this is 26.5, and the front was 25 3/4. So let me go ahead and take out that excess along this line that I drew up into the shoulder. Eliminate 3/4 of an inch here just by shifting that closed and taking out this extra wedge of fullness right along like where the raglan line of the sleeve would be. Then I can walk this underarm seam here and make sure it is the same length and that we're on the right track, and just smooth off that curve and cut out the rest of the back. I have shown this long version of the all-in-one sleeve here on the channel before in a different 1940s dress in a nice floopy green rayon fabric, so if you'd like to see that, I can link that video in a card here as well. Alright, once again I will trace a facing to finish the back neckline as well. 2.5 inches wide is my standard for my facings. You can make them as large as you want. Probably can't go over like 3 inches. Depends on if you want a narrower facing or not. 2.5 seems a good standard to me. It's what I was taught. I believe in fashion school, and I've just stuck with it. I assume that's where that came from, for most things were drilled into me at that time, as you can imagine, because when you are gaining or losing points on your grade for how well you follow directions, you learn to stick to those directions. Alright, so we have a back facing, we have a front facing, we have a front and a back. I now, of course, will need the skirt for this, and I am just going to be using my standard straight skirt, my basic block skirt patterns, which aka is a straight-sided pencil skirt pattern, so that's what I'm going to be using with this. Here's a tracing of that. This one is actually 34 inches long, and I will hem this 2 inches up for a rather long skirt today, but I think that really elongates my personal shape and proportion, so I actually quite like a longer midi-length skirt on me. And again, if you'd like to see how to make a basic block skirt pattern, I do have a video here on the channel for that as well. I actually will run out of cards, so I won't put that in a card, but I will link to it below. And here is my sort of boucle textured dark navy blue fabric. This fabric is kind of strange. I think it was a cotton blend. I have no idea what's going on here. There's plenty of spandex in it. It's not a knit, but it's also not a normal woven either. And in my memory, it was only a 2-way stretch, but here, as we can see, it's a 4-way stretch. And we can also see my bodice pattern pieces don't fit on here, which is why you often see a seam here, either a raglan, like an angled seam, or a seam like where the short all-in-one would end and where the long all-in-one continues on. You do often see a seam here in 1940s designs, and it's perfectly acceptable to add one in there. Just remember to add seam allowance to both the sleeve piece and the bodice piece if you do separate them. But because today I am personally working with a 4-way stretch fabric, unfortunately, I will go ahead and cut these on the cross grain instead just to get around this issue. And I did still cut the skirt portion of this out on the straight grain, because in this textured fabric you really can't tell the difference anyhow. It's a solid, boucle-ish looking texture, so no one will ever know except for you. And the first dress I made that I mentioned in the beginning of this video was actually made with a slight 2-way stretch fabric. It's like a rayon jacquarded kind of sateen weight fabric that's made out of rayon with a slight spandex in it. And that 2-way stretch is super nice to have in a dress like this that, again, I can dress up or down. I can wear it in the car for long periods of time without feeling uncomfortable. I can wear it while traveling and still feel chic, even though I'm a little bit more comfortable in a slight stretch dress. This one will be even more comfortable because this fabric is even stretchier, which makes it a little bit more annoying to sew, but I guess technically a little bit nicer to wear. But now that I have everything cut out, I am of course transferring all relevant information from my pattern onto the backs of my fabric pieces. Starting here with the tucks, so I'm just marking the start and end of those tuck like dart leg marks, like so, and I'll connect those with some tailor's chalk, even though again, this fabric being so spongy and textured did not want to take tailor's chalk well, so eventually I switched to a gel pen when I started marking the darts for the skirt because this chalk was frustrating me. But doing my best here to mark those. I can then pinch and pin these, which I'll show you how I sew these tucks. It's not very different from sewing darts in the end, but I'll walk you through it today. I'm sorry some of our footage today is a bit grainy and strange. I was trying to find a good balance between having the ISO turned up enough that we could see what was going on in this dark navy blue fabric, but also trying not to get too grainy and sad. It's a fine balance here in the basement when we're using no natural light and doing my best here. But I will need to mark my darts on the back bodice pieces and of course on the front and backs of the skirts as well. So I have a lot of dart marking and pinching and pinning to do before I can set everything all ready to go by the machine so I can batch process myself through these tucks and darts. And it is snowing here in Colorado today, so please forgive me if the heater kicks on or you hear any random buzzing in the background. That will be the central heating turning on. Doing my best to avoid that and record in between when the heater is on, but I'm not cruel enough today, of all days, to tell my family to turn the heater off. Alright, over on the machine, I'm actually using black Gutermann all-purpose thread today because this is a very dark navy blue, and I didn't have any navy thread that matched, so we just went with black and we're hoping for the best. I'll start at the large end of the dart and sew off the tips, and of course tie my threads there at the tips shut and cut them down to about 1 inch long. Again, this is just how I always sew my darts. It's always worked for me. If you have a way of sewing darts that works for you, stick with it, I always say. I'm not a purist when it comes to these things. There are several things that come highly recommended from me, clipping your curves, taping your floops, things like that. But, there are many ways to do different things in sewing, and I am not a purist. If something works for you, I say stick with it. And for my tucks, it's a very similar process. Again, start at the large end, and instead of sewing down an entire triangle and off the tip, I just stop where I want to, do a little bit of back stitching, cut off my excess threads, and we have a tuck. Magic. Someone did ask me what the difference between a tuck and a pleat is. And I guess a pleat maybe isn't always sewn down like this as far. I'm not exactly positive the exact distinctions between a pleat and a tuck. Maybe all tucks are pleats, but not all pleats are tucks. I don't know. Something like that. It's a square rectangle situation. But I'll pin the other two here, now that the first two are sewn, and then I can stitch these into place and think about how I'm going to finish my raw edges today. And again, because this isn't actually totally a knit fabric, I mean, it behaves almost like one because it's a 4-way stretch, but I think it technically counts as a woven, almost like a crepe woven. It's very strange. I am going to run all my edges through the serger today as a way to finish those, especially because I want them to retain that little bit of stretch, because otherwise I think funkier things will happen. So I ran all these edges through the serger in the end. You could, of course, use round seam binding, cut with pinking shears, many different ways to finish raw edges, or of course fully line the garment as well, always an option. But I just ran this through the serger because it was a little bit stretchy anyhow, so might as well retain that stretch and again make the world's comfiest, yet hopefully slightly chic 1940s inspired dress. And I will bring my pieces back over onto the ironing board. They might need a little bit of steam and pressing just to lay perfectly flat again because of the inherent spandex going on here, unfortunately, or elastine or elastin or whatever the heck is in this fabric. But I'll go ahead and pin my skirt pieces together. So I have the skirt front that was cut along the fold, and I'm setting both back pieces along the side seams, so I can sew those together first. And then my skirt will be ready to attach to the bodice for the dress. Very simple today, of course. Nothing simpler than a pencil skirt, as long as you are not afraid of darts, and goodness knows, I am not. Let me go ahead and do the same sort of operation for the bodice as well. So I have the front laid out underneath here, and then I'll lay one of the back pieces on here, right sides together, and pin along the top shoulder seam / top arm seam. Again, with the all-in-one, it becomes all-in-one. And I will actually pin the underarm seam on this as well, and just do this whole side all at once. I'm going to go ahead and fuse some lightweight fusible interfacing onto my facing pieces here before I sew those together at the shoulder seam, just to give these a little bit more structure than the rest of this, because goodness knows I need it with this strange fabric. And over here on the machine, I'll stitch those together. 1/2-inch seam allowance as always. This is loaded with a size 14 Microtex needle just from my last project. I just didn't bother to change it. Worked just fine for this. And I will sew my long seams for the bodice here. Trying to remember to remove my pins as I go and try not to stretch any of this out, the top or the bottom of this out as I go, because again, this fabric is a little too stretchy for my liking. But once things arrive from online shopping and get put in the stash, they must eventually be used. And therefore, if a fabric is a little bit too stretchy, that's not enough to disqualify it from entering my wardrobe, that's for sure. sew my skirt seams that I pinned as well. And because in the end this will be a very comfortable dress, thanks to this extra stretch involved, I can wear this for a full day out antiquing, driving up and down, you know, hopefully the Hudson in New York soon, going to all the little antique shops and trying to find bargains. Here's hoping. I like to, you know, dress for the life you want, as it were. Now I'll press my seams on this facing here, real quick, these little tiny shoulder seams, and then I can run this outside edge through the serger as well, for consistency's sake. And then I will press open the side seams of my skirt, including using the tailor's ham over the curved section for those. Half of sewing is pressing, as we all know at this point. And I actually don't love ironing, but I don't mind it while I'm sewing. But afterwards, I would much rather steam something with like a clothing steamer, like a full-size one. I need a new one. When I move, eventually, I will get one, hopefully. Though there are many things on the list before that, unfortunately. Again, give this other side of the bodice a little bit of a press, and then again, sew the top shoulder/arm seam and the underarm/side seam as well. Just like I did the first side, over here once again. Again, trying not to stretch any one bit of it out more than the rest. I did see an absolutely delicious sewing machine out recently. It was a size 66 model, which is this Singer 99K is the portable version of, but I saw a Singer 66 probably from the 1920s, I want to say, because it had very Egyptian motifs all over it. So instead of this like simple gold kind of Art Deco, I don't know, paintwork on this machine, it had papyrus and all these Egyptian motifs on it in multicolors. And it was very cool, and it was set into its table still. I think it was $350 for the machine and for the table. If it was a motorized machine, I probably would have been in more trouble and been more tempted, but it was a treadle machine, and me and treadles don't get along, sadly enough. I could probably figure out how to get it motorized or take it to someone, but it was a very cool machine. I sadly don't need it right now, but that doesn't mean I didn't want it, I'll tell you that. And once I have all my seams pressed for the bodice here, I can go ahead and attach my facing to the neckline. To finish this off, I'll just mark exactly where I need to turn my needle on there. Pin this along the V-neck of the front, and of course match up my shoulder seams, and pin this into place around the curve of the neckline. So I can sew this and finish off this last raw edge left on my bodice. And back over on the machine to stitch that, just stitching around the curves. And I will actually kind of do a little bit of back stitching right where the V point at the front is, just for a little bit of extra security right here at the V, where I'm going to clip this in a moment. I have to clip this curve as well, and I will do some understitching on this facing to hold it into place, so you'll see that in just a moment. And then I will just give this a little bit of a press, a tiny bit of steam, of coaxing into the shape it needs to be before I bring it back over to the machine for that understitching. Making sure that the seam allowance is all underneath the facing here, and I'm just going to stitch close to the seam edge along the facing, stitching that seam allowance down to the underside of the facing itself. That way when I fold the facing to the inside, it stays rolled under where it needs to be. It gives me a nice clean finish on the outside of my neckline. And I'll press this into place. I'll just go ahead and pin this along the shoulder seams, where I will tack this later by hand. Make sure my facing stays in place, tucked under like this. And again, a dress like this is actually a very simple and straightforward, quick project for me at this point. So this took me, maybe 6 hours total, 4 or 5 hours one night, and then a few hours the next day to finish everything up. So it would definitely be a good weekend project if you wanted a new dress by Monday, that sort of thing. But once my neckline is all pressed and currently tucked into place, I can go ahead and sew the bodice onto the skirt along the waist. So I'll pin my side seams together first, pin everything together along the waistline, and then I can stitch these together. It always feels a little bit strange and risky to just put one line of stitching in to hold the whole dress together, but then again, I've never had one split on me, so I guess you could do 2 lines of stitching here if you wanted to, feel more secure about it, but I've actually personally never had one break. So I guess that's probably just luck, I suppose. I don't know. I guess if it were to snap, I could just fix it because it's me. So no problem there. I guess that's an endorsement for Gutermann thread, which not spawn, as usual. I've yet to do any sponsored content in life. We'll see if that ever changes. It's probably pretty rare to have someone approach me that I would actually consider engaging with. Although if Gutermann wants to send me a lifetime supply of black thread, I would probably accept that. I will press open this waist seam now that it is sewn. I can start thinking about putting my zipper down the center back of this dress. You can see I found a nice dark navy one, but I will go ahead and reinforce the back 1.5 inches or so before I do that with some, again, fusible interfacing in this nice gray color. I did have some questions about what kind of interfacing I like recently, and I'm not very specific or picky about it. If I'm on mood and I need some, and I'm already ordering other things, I'll grab some lightweight interfacing. I usually just use Pellon when I run out, basically. I try and keep a couple of yards hanging around, but I'm not very picky about it. I'm not an expert when it comes to interfacings or interlinings, that's for sure. But I have the waistline pinned together here, and then I'm going to measure how far down my zipper comes to along the back of the skirt portion of this dress, and I will stitch about 10 inches down from there, and then leave the rest of this back seam open as a slit so I can walk in this, although again, it's probably stretchy enough that if I have a straight cut skirt, I could still walk in it, but on principle, I will leave a slit back here. So I just need to sew this short back seam here, and once I do that, I can press all the seam allowance down the center back of my dress, that 1-inch seam allowance I left earlier in the pattern drafting stage, open, and prepare this for setting my zipper in. I'm just going to grab my hem gauge to help me with that. You can see my skirt is about 1/4 inch longer than my waistline of my bodice, if that makes any sense. If you're looking really closely right here at the waist, that's just a quirk of my pattern that's been there a long time that I haven't fixed yet. So I just eliminate it when doing the zipper like this. It doesn't bother me, that's for sure, other than that I have to explain myself to you. But now that this is folded back and ironed into place, I can go ahead and pin the folded edge of the right-hand side of my dress opening along the zipper teeth, along the zipper tape, I suppose, if that makes sense. Again, if you'd like to see me insert a zipper in a fabric that is a little bit less dark and murky, I do have a video all about how I sew in my lapped zippers. So if you'd like to see that, I will link it in a card here, as I do most of the time, honestly. But I have switched over to my zipper foot here on the machine, and I'll just stitch this folded edge down to the zipper tape, again, right next to the teeth. Your zipper feet may vary. Of course, this one is vintage to match the vintage Singer machine, although I have been told that most feet should still work on this machine because of the style of shank. So I haven't tried any modern feet on this machine, but apparently it will work one day. And once I have this first side sewn down, I can go ahead and again overlap for my lapped zipper the other side here, the left-hand side, folded edge, just covering up that stitching and covering up my zipper tape, and I can sew this down as well. And again, I apologize for having the exposure on the camera turned up quite this much. Everything else is a little bit blown out, but I wanted you to be able to see what I was doing with this dark navy fabric, which is of course such a huge departure from my usual black. And here, part of the end of my threads got stuck. Just slice through that so I can keep sewing, and I'll stitch down the other side of my zipper here cleanly into place. Alright, zipper is in. I just need to tack my facing down along the inside, so I'll fold and press that into place so that I can sit at my desk and hand stitch this down. I do need to start filming this step again. It's a little bit hard in this cramped sewing room, so eventually hopefully I'll have more space and I can have a better setup for each station. I have had people watch the sewing room tour and say, I didn't realize that that room was so small. And it's not like absolutely tiny, but it's also not giant, and there's plenty of furniture in here kind of taking up space, so I look forward to having a new setup hopefully soon. I will also hem my sleeves here. I'm just going to turn those up about 5/8 of an inch and then stitch those into place again by hand. And then I will stitch the hem of this dress as well. Again, this is a 34-inch long skirt, so quite long, quite a midi length. So I will go ahead and turn this up 2 full inches here, again using my hem gauge as a guide for that. And I will stitch along the opening of this slit back here to hold it hemmed as well. But this is one of my last steps for this dress, but not the last step, because I had raised that shoulder earlier, and part of what I liked about the first dress I made in this sort of style was the shoulder pads. So I wanted to make a simple little shoulder pad to stick in here as well. So I'm just going to layer up some semicircles of felt. This is just regular craft felt here. You can use cotton batting, is really what I prefer, but I didn't have any. So just using some felt that I bulked up here, and I just cut these semicircles out by eye. I didn't make a pattern for this or anything. Maybe 5 or 6 inches long along the straight edge, and then just like a semicircle from there. Not quite sure. I made it up. But I actually just layered them in matching scraps of the fabric, and then I just serged that edge. You could, of course, sew these right sides together and then turn them right side out and all that jazz. But I just like to serge the raw edge of my shoulder pads. I don't get super couture about shoulder pads, sadly enough. But I'll feed the threads back through and actually give those a quick steam and a press along the tailor's ham to make them slightly curved. Just give my tucks a little bit of a press. While I'm in here fussing with the shoulders of my dress, you do see tucks like these on 1940s designs quite often. And I will lay my shoulder pads in here so that they line up with where that shoulder tip on my pattern was earlier. Like the end of this ends up where the shoulder tip would be on the regular pattern. And I'll just tack these along the seam allowance of the shoulder seam and then along the facing as well. So they are fully removable later if I want to add in larger ones, which I might, because these are actually quite mild as far as shoulder pads go, or take them out entirely. I can in the future. So it is nice in a simple dress like this one to leave this rather versatile and have these be removable, as so many people do when they find nice things at the thrift store. They take the shoulder pads out. For the 80s, it makes sense because the shoulder pads are too much. I did buy a Terry Mugler jacket once where they had removed the shoulder pads, and that is like sacrilegious to do to a Terry Mugler. So do be careful when removing shoulder pads from vintage clothes, because in the case of designer things, they are truly meant to be there. And here is my finished navy 1940s inspired dress with its strong shoulder and long dolman sleeves. Once again, I think I can style this in a myriad of ways for both daytime and evening, and of course navy is quite the neutral, so I can pair it with lots of different colors of accessories from my wardrobe. And despite this being a simpler project today, I hope you still enjoyed seeing how this dress came together, and thank you as always for watching. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!